Let's get right to those heartbreaking scenes out of Afghanistan. The airport in Kabul now reopened after descending into chaos Monday as desperate Afghans tried to flee the country. The Pentagon is now saying it will try to extract 22,000 Afghans who help the U.S. military and are eligible for special immigrant visas.
We want to show you this image that is giving us a sense of the desperation. Hundreds of Afghans trying to escape packed into a plane. Two U.S. defense officials confirmed that this photo was taken inside a U.S. Air Force plane heading from Kabul to Qatar on Monday. President Biden briefly returned to the White House from Camp David, defending his decision to withdraw U.S. troops, saying he does not regret the move and that the buck stops with him.
I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces.
We have a team lined up around the world to cover all of the latest developments this morning. Let's start with NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli, who is near Camp David. So, Mike, President Biden is back there at Camp David this morning. As we mentioned, he stood by his decision to withdraw, but he also placed the blame for the chaos on the Afghan government. What was the main message he was trying to get across with this address to the country?
Well, Joe, obviously the pressure was mounting on the president to speak out and speak out quickly. So he interrupted his time here at Camp David to head back to the White House, deliver those remarks to the country. And he made it clear that there's no regret on his part about his decision to end this so-called forever war in Afghanistan. He did say the buck stops with me. He accepted responsibility, but that doesn't mean he was not willing to share some of the blame. And his comments about the Afghan leadership and the capability of the Afghan security forces was quite striking. Take a listen to that part of the president's address.
The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
Officials are privately telling NBC News more about their frustration in dealing with the Afghan government over the past few months, about their efforts to try to get the Afghan government to tackle corruption, for instance, to take some steps, more steps with the Taliban to try to get to reconciliation in terms of the future of that country, none of which the Afghan government ultimately pursued. It's notable, of course, that the president has returned to Camp David, but another development, the White House press secretary Jen Psaki was supposed to be off this week. She is going to be briefing at the White House this afternoon, along with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, an indication of how the White House really needs to keep getting its side, its message out during this crisis.
You know, Mike, we are also hearing from former President George W. Bush. He released a statement late last night. He was, of course, the first president to preside over the war in Afghanistan. What was his message?
Yeah, remember, this has been a part of the President Biden's message about this Afghanistan decision, saying he is the fourth president to be dealing with the situation in Afghanistan, and he was determined not to hand it off to a fifth president. We did hear, of course, from President Bush, the first president who launched that war 20 years ago. And he said, of course, he's been closely monitoring the situation, that the president has promised to evacuate Afghans along with American citizens and our allies. He said the United States government has the legal authority to cut the red tape for refugees during this urgent humanitarian crisis. Remember what we've been hearing from Biden officials about the slow pace of processing those SIVs, of getting those officials and the Afghan allies out of Afghanistan. Part of the delay, they said, was because they needed Congress to pass a change in the authorizing legislation. And here's the former president making clear now in the state of crisis, they have the authority to cut through some of that bottleneck.
You know, so much of the focus is on what happens next. A few hours after the president spoke, the State Department said negotiations are going on with reps from the Taliban and from the Afghan government. Tell us more about that, what the Biden administration would be trying to work with here.
Well, over the course of the past year, since President Trump initially made this agreement with the Taliban, the U.S. has had a role at what these talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government, we should say the former Afghan government now, in Doha, Qatar. Those talks have been continuing. But Ned Price, the State Department spokesperson, made it clear yesterday that just because the Taliban is now in control of the country, it doesn't mean that they'll have the full U.S. support and cooperation. And there are specific conditions that the U.S. is going to be looking for. Here is Ned Price spelling those out.
The fact is that a future Afghan government that upholds the basic rights of its people, that doesn't harbor terrorists, and that protects the basic rights of its people, including the basic fundamental rights of half of its population, its women and girls, that is a government that we would be able to work with. The converse is also true. We are not going to support a government that does not do that.
What has been so striking so quickly after the fall of the Afghan government is how some of the other key nations in the region are reacting as well. Russia, for instance, saying that it will maintain its embassy in Kabul, plans no interruptions there. The Chinese government also making it clear that it intends to try to seek stability in the region as well. We have heard from Taliban spokespersons, including one who spoke to our colleague Ayman Mohyeldin yesterday, issuing some interesting comments. They know the eyes of the world are upon them and promising that women and girls will have some of the same rights that they did under the previous Afghan government. But we'll see.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit more about China in just a few moments. Mike, I also know we're hearing partisan reactions out of Congress. The National Republican Congressional Committee is fundraising off the crisis, while Speaker Pelosi is standing behind President Biden. But now Democratic Senator Jack Reed, who's chair of the Armed Services Committee, is calling for a hearing into what went wrong. What did he say the committee hopes to learn?
Yeah, it's really notable, the comments from Jack Reed. He's a longtime senator, now the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. He's not really a partisan bomb thrower by any means. And when he finally did issue a statement last night, it was striking that he took a much broader view of what he said was 20 years of crisis in the making. And he laid out some of the conditions he said led us to this moment. The first being the pivot, as he put it, to a war of choice in Iraq, the failure of a policy with, as he put it, duplicitous Pakistan, mission creep. We've heard the president talk about this as well, from a narrow focus of counterterrorism to the broader attempts at nation building. And lastly, the lack of an ability to build the Afghan government. We heard the president, of course, speak squarely to the frustrations there as well.
All right, Mike Memoli kicking us off this morning. Mike, thanks for your reporting.
For more on what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan and reaction from the rest of the world, let's bring in Ali Arouzi and Megan Fitzgerald. Good morning to both of you. And Ali, I will begin with you and just get a sense of what is happening on the ground now. I know we're seeing flights resuming in and out of Kabul airport this morning. What's the latest after yesterday's chaotic scenes?
Hey, Savannah. Well, after those extraordinary scenes yesterday of the runway at Kabul airport inundated with people running alongside moving aircrafts that were preparing to take off, people clinging to the undercarriage of the plane, falling to their death, some of them, and U.S. troops forced to open fire on some armed Afghans that breached the airport. Flights were suspended yesterday. The evacuation from Kabul ground to a halt, but this morning it has started again. Flights are resuming out of the airport. NATO's senior civilian representative to Afghanistan posted a video showing the runway empty with American troops on the tarmac. He wrote, "The runway is open. I see airplanes landing and taking off." And overnight, flight tracking data showed a U.S. Marine Hercules plane at the airport and then later taking off for Qatar, which is home to CENTCOM headquarters. So things are resuming. That chaos of yesterday seems to have calmed down, and there seems to be some semblance of an evacuation taking place and more control over the airport. So we'll have to see how that pans out through the course of the day.
And now, Megan, in addition to that U.S. flight that Ali just referenced, Britain has also been evacuating Afghan nationals as well as its own civilians. What's the latest there, and how's the U.K. planning to manage its relationship with the Taliban?
Well, Savannah, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said they will continue to evacuate hundreds of British nationals a day as long as it's safe to do so. They're also evacuating Afghans who are eligible as well. Right now, we know there's some 600 British troops on the ground there trying to make sure that this is as smooth and as safe of a process as possible. Now, as it relates to the Taliban, an official has come out and said that they want women to remain in government, also saying that women aren't victims. And the British government, I can tell you, is saying they are going to hold the Taliban to that and they won't accept anything less. I want you to take a listen to a British official.
We're using our G7 presidency to make very clear to the Taliban that we will hold them to account for their commitment and never to allow Afghanistan to be used as a base for terror, to hold a more inclusive government and to protect the most essential human rights, including respecting the rights of women.
But it's important to note that there's still great fear on the ground there in Afghanistan among specifically women and children, concern about what the Taliban will do next. You see how they're closing down beauty salons that women once worked in and frequented. They're painting over pictures of women without head coverings. So at this point, it really is a wait and see as to what the Taliban will do next. Savannah?
Yeah, Ali, that's exactly where I want to pick it up also with you. So multiple reports this morning say the Taliban has announced a, quote, amnesty across the country, though it's not at all clear what that means. And, of course, there are reports to the contrary. But we're also hearing that they're urging women to join the government, which obviously sounds a little bit in conflict with the reporting that Megan just said and video that we saw, footage we saw ourselves yesterday. What can you tell us about that? And is there any indication that this Taliban rule would be different than the brutal one we saw of the 90s?
That's right, Savannah. A senior member of the Taliban's Cultural Commission said that the Islamic Emirate, that's how the Taliban now refer to Afghanistan, doesn't want women to be victims. He said that they should be in government structures according to Sharia law. But he also added that the structure of the government isn't entirely clear. And Savannah, I can tell you that many people, both in Afghanistan and the West, are deeply skeptical about these comments. They feel that there are hollow words or just a smokescreen to make sure that basic needs of the country function until they're in full control in various positions. Look, Savannah, the Taliban have a terrible track record. They've never shown any signs of wanting to reform or become more moderate. When they ran Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, they were one of the most brutal, ultra-conservative, oppressive regimes in modern history. Stonings, amputations, and public executions in soccer stadiums were daily occurrences. Women had no rights. They had to cover their face. They weren't allowed to work. They were largely confined to their homes and only allowed to leave if accompanied by a male relative. And girls were banned from going to school. I mean, just yesterday, the UN Secretary General expressed particular concern about the future of women and girls in the country. So it's not the words of the Taliban that people are going to be watching closely, but rather their actions in the coming days and weeks.
Absolutely. Ali and Megan, thank you so much, both of you, for your reporting this morning.
General David Petraeus oversaw U.S. allied forces during America's longest war. NBC Nightly News anchor Lester Holt spoke with the retired four-star general on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Taliban's quick takeover of the country.
Certainly the outcome, I think, is catastrophic. It's also heartbreaking, it's tragic, and I do think there were alternative approaches, options that we, in fact, should have considered. But we are where we are now. And I think what's most important at this moment in time is to realize that there are many that we have so far left behind. And we must do everything we can with all the resources available to us to ensure that we meet the moral obligation to them.
Was there any version of the story that did not end with the Taliban back in charge?
Certainly there was. There was a sustained commitment that could have been pursued. I think that it was really the psychological effect of our announcement of the withdrawal, then the actual withdrawal, and then very significantly the withdrawal of the contractors that kept the U.S. provided helicopters and planes in the air and showed the Afghan soldiers on the ground that there would be someone coming to the rescue. And if soldiers on the ground don't think that that is coming, then they're going to do what we have seen Afghan soldiers do in the past week. And by the way, Afghan soldiers fought and died in huge numbers over the course of the past 2 decades. So the idea that they wouldn't fight for their country is something that I think is just not accurate.
What would you say to American soldiers and their families who risked their lives, who sacrificed their lives, who came back wounded from this war? What would you tell them right now as they watch all this play out?
That they should be quietly proud that when our country needed them, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, that they volunteered to step forward and serve our country at a time of war. I feel enormously privileged to have done that as well, and indeed to have led them in Afghanistan as well as in Iraq.
Are we facing the same Taliban that was running the country up until the U.S. invasion, or have they evolved into something different?
I think they have evolved in the sense that they are more conscious of their public relations campaign. But I think the actions on the ground seem to indicate that they are the same old Taliban, that they're an ultra-conservative, medieval, theocratic organization that seeks to establish an Islamist emirate. I am fairly confident Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State will be able to reestablish sanctuaries, but we will, without question, keep an eye on that, disrupt it, degrade it, and ideally destroy it when that happens. But that's going to be vastly more difficult given the distance from which we'll have to operate.
So you see a military role in Afghanistan, but really more from looking at for our own strategic interests rather than stabilization.
I don't see how we would get involved in stabilization of a country run by the Taliban, Lester. I wonder whether we'll even reestablish an embassy anytime soon. So, no, I don't see a role other than to ensure that we can identify activities by Al-Qaeda and also by the Islamic State affiliate in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region when they try to reestablish the kind of sanctuary that Al-Qaeda had when they planned the 9/11 attacks in Afghanistan under Taliban control.
Many U.S. veterans who served in Afghanistan are voicing concern and heartbreak as the world watches the Taliban's takeover of the country. Kristen Rouse joins us now. She is a U.S. Army veteran who served multiple times in Afghanistan and a board member of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. Kristen, good morning. Thank you for your time this morning. And my first question to you is just, what has it been like for you, as somebody who's been on the ground there multiple times, to see these scenes unfolding in Afghanistan over the last few days?
This has been so hard to watch. So many of us have been in touch with Afghans who we have friendships with, relationships with, the interpreters we worked with, other staff who've been part of this 20-year enterprise to build a better Afghanistan, to build a hopeful Afghanistan, to work alongside Afghans in building a better country. Afghans have lost. They've expended so much blood and pain and effort in the effort over the last 20 years. We've expended American lives defending so much of the ground that's been lost, and that has been so hard to watch. But the people that we invested in, so many of them are still alive, and they are trying to get out, and veterans are trying to get them out. If we want to preserve the investment, the relationships, the effort that we've expended, please, we need to get our allies, our friends out before the Taliban comes from them. We are hearing reports that the Taliban is going door to door, identifying any Afghans who have worked for Americans in an interpreter capacity, but in other capacities as well, journalists, aid workers, government workers, all across the spectrum. Any number less than 100,000 plus evacuees, we should be alarmed that it's not enough. I myself have been messaging with folks outside of the Kabul airport. I was messaging with folks in the chaos yesterday. We desperately need to get people out. We need to see as many flights filled with evacuees as possible. We have the aircraft. We need to be moving it 24/7 to get our friends out.
A message from someone who knows many of those people and who knows what it was like on the ground there. Kristen Rouse, thank you, of course, for joining us this morning, but more importantly, for your service.
Amid all the evacuations from Afghanistan, one country is holding off. China is urging its citizens to remain indoors in Afghanistan, but it is keeping its Kabul embassy open. Yesterday, the country's foreign ministry said China is ready for, quote, friendly and cooperative relations with the Taliban. NBC News foreign correspondent Janice Mackey-Frayer joins us now from Beijing. So, Janice, what else can you tell us about China's reaction to the Taliban taking power in Afghanistan? Why are they keeping their embassy open?
Well, a Taliban takeover in Afghanistan represents challenges for China, but also opportunities. And Beijing has been laying the groundwork for some time for these quote-unquote friendly relations that they hope to establish with the group. This is a shift from the past. Back in 1996, China refused to recognize Taliban rule, closed their embassy there. This time, the embassy is remaining open, and officials told me yesterday that they are remaining in close contact and communication with the Taliban to ensure the safety of the few voluntary staff that they have left there. A lot of this shift started to happen even a few weeks ago. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi hosted talks in Tianjin, that's close to Beijing, with a Taliban delegation led by Mullah Baradar. They emerged from those meetings, they took pictures together, they released statements, and both sides seemed satisfied that the talks were productive. According to Chinese officials yesterday, the Afghan Taliban have repeatedly expressed their hope to develop good relations for China, and they look forward to China's participation in the reconstruction of the country. So at this point, it's not outright recognition of the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan, but it is cautious support, which is more than what most countries are extending right now.
You know, Janice, part of the story here is that China has strong economic interests across Central Asia and Pakistan. So is it worried that rising Taliban influence could affect them and impact those interests?
Undoubtedly, China has big economic interests in Afghanistan, massive investments in infrastructure, minerals and mining, as well as oil. So they're looking to protect those interests, but also looking to extend their influence. On the other side of it, too, the Taliban sees opportunity and economic benefit in cooperating with China, especially with the massive Belt and Road Initiative that is stretching across Central Asia. It's why, in meeting with the Taliban, China wanted to extract security assurances. Security is the main driver for China in this. They have fears of extremism on their border with Afghanistan in the western part of the country, specifically in Xinjiang. They were able to get the assurance from the Taliban that they would not have their fighters use Afghan territory as a base to launch attacks inside China, but Chinese officials say that they are now expecting to hold the Taliban to their word.
Yeah, and I mean, Janice, China has been criticized heavily for how it treats its Muslim Uyghur minority, a group that lives in that region right next to Afghanistan. Can we expect the Taliban to get involved at all there with that? And how would China react if something like that did happen?
Well, China's fear of extremism has been used as justification for its treatment of and detention of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. They want these security assurances from the Taliban if the Taliban wants to have an economic relationship. But we have to remember, too, that China has been just as uncomfortable with a large U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. It's why China could see some strategic gain in the region with the withdrawal. The state media here has been having a field day, calling the U.S. withdrawal a disaster, painting it as the end of American influence. So China could stand to see some strategic gains. But again, they are at this point hesitant to say that they will outright recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government in Afghanistan. I put that question to the Foreign Ministry spokesperson yesterday. They did not give a clear answer, so I think we can safely call it cautious support, but again, China among the few countries giving that.
All right, Janice reporting from Beijing. Janice, thank you.